Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into a topic that has sparked intense debate, the intersection of autism and transgender identity. And specifically, we're going to look at the growing concern that some autistic children may be disproportionately influenced into believing that they are transgender, and whether the current push for affirmation-only approaches might be doing more harm than good. We're going to back this up with some scientific studies, some expert opinions, and real-world cases. So stick around, because this is going to be a very important conversation.
Gender dysphoria, they were different, and you could clump them into groups. So there was the people who used to be called transsexual, and these were people who wanted to permanently change their bodies, who believed that they should be the opposite sex. That was about 25% of the patients. And then there were about 26% of the patients were people who had a sex change and then regretted it, and they may or may not have detransitioned, but they were post-operative regretters. And then there was a huge amount of transvestites. Nobody talks about transvestites anymore, but there's always been far more transvestites than transsexuals. And they're people who don't want to change sex. They just want to temporarily reside in the vestiges of the opposite sex, either because they get excited or because they get sexually excited. So there were fetishist or non-fetishist transvestites. And then there was the autogynephiles, AGP, which often gender critical people confuse for transvestites, but they're men who get sexually excited by the fantasy of having a vagina and breasts. And there was a very small number, about 5%. With gender dysphoria, they were different, and you could clump them into groups. So there was the people who used to be called transsexual, and these were people who wanted to permanently change their bodies. I was there. I also spent a couple of days a week in the Tabby Kids service, and my role there was mainly to be a heckler and a troublemaker, because what I saw was camp boys and tomboys coming in and being trans. And I said to the director at the time, isn't what you're doing mad? Because these kids these are 4 or 5 year olds. Aren't they just going to end up being gay boys and lesbians, or just neither? And his response was, would it be any more mad than them being gay? And this came from the Tavistock, where homosexuality was considered an inversion. It was pathological. I went through 2 terms of teaching. I trained there on the pathology of homosexuality. Anyway, that's the background to the clinic. The Portman Clinic was very gender critical, and they were happy for me to set up these groups. What I found was that in the transsexual subgroup, there was almost 100% autism, and or trauma, and or internalized homophobia. And the thing about autism is it gives you a very black and white, rigid framework. You're very rules-based. And their idea of what it meant to be a male or female was very, very rules-based. So you can divide people into the gender confident, who do what they like with their appearance, and they say, well, if I don't fit in your framework, your framework's rubbish. Or the gender underconfident, the autistic person who says, I need to be like this, and this, and if I'm not, I must be other. And they're not able to be subversive or creative. And what I found was that the degree of autism also correlated with how likely they were or not to regret it. I was there. I also spent a couple of days a week in the Tabby Kids service, and my role there was mainly to be a heckler and a troublemaker, because what I saw was camp boys and tomboys coming in and being trans. And I said
So first up, let's talk about the data. Research shows that autistic individuals are significantly more likely to identify as transgender or non-binary compared to neurotypical individuals. A 2020 study which was published in Nature Communications found that autistic individuals are actually 3 to 6 times more likely to identify as gender diverse. But why is this happening? Well, there's several theories, and one is that autistic individuals often struggle with rigid thinking patterns and obsessive interests. Some researchers suggest that for some autistic children, gender dysphoria may become a focal point, something that they latch onto as a special interest. Another factor is social naivety. Autistic individuals often have difficulty reading social cues and may be more susceptible to social contagion. And this is especially concerning when we consider how online communities promote gender identity as the answer to a various array of struggles, from anxiety to depression. Now, my experience with somebody who grew up as an undiagnosed autistic person, when I started to go through puberty, I started to experience a lot of body dysmorphia. And I actually ended up going into the pro-anorexic movement, where I was part of a social contagion of the pro-anorexia movement, which basically said that being deathly thin and even dying of anorexia was something to be heralded, and was something that was beautiful and wonderful. Now, as an autistic person, as a teenager, a young person, we are all very vulnerable to these kinds of kind of ideologies. And for the pro-anorexia movement, it was very cult-like. It was that we all kind of were part of this thing that made me feel that I was part of something, finally accepted into something. And I think for autistic people, the feeling of wanting to be accepted is very, very high. So if we have movements or ideologies that are incredibly accepting and incredibly kind of like, you know, encouraging, like the pro-anorexia movement was for me, and I see similarities between that and the transgender community, where it is acceptance, acceptance, acceptance. I think sometimes we have to recognize that there are vulnerable people like autistic people that are not suffering from gender dysphoria, but are suffering from difficulties due to their autism and going through puberty, that may be encouraged to take a pathway that isn't actually correct for them, because we are coming from affirmation instead of questioning. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and I don't think that the transgender community is a bunch of evil people who are trying to brainwash our kids and, you know, damage them or whatever. But I do think that we need to be very careful about how we go about helping people that are displaying, you know, any form of dysphoria, you know, or you know, body dysmorphia. You know, I think that we have to recognize that there may be other approaches that need to be taken before we start to come in with these big medical interventions. I'm aware this is a very sensitive topic, and it's something that I've avoided talking about for a very long time, but I'm talking now.
Growing up, I didn't really show any signs of gender dysphoria. I was perfectly happy. Every girl is uncomfortable with their changing body. And when I was 13, I started to struggle a lot with depression, anxiety, that sort of stuff. I spent a lot of time on the internet, specifically TikTok, way more than I should have. There were a million videos of all these trans people coming out. And because I was so unhappy with myself and who I was, I thought that that might be what was wrong with me. And I went really far to pass as a male, to the point where nobody that I knew that I was born a female. Here's a little picture of me from that time. When I first transitioned, I really didn't have any issues with my body, but as I went on, I realized that I needed to fit into this box if I wanted to be a male. And because of how my body did not fit into that box, I became increasingly more uncomfortable with it. But it wasn't gender dysphoria. It was me trying to fit myself into a box that I simply didn't fit into.
So Dr. Lisa Lippman, a researcher from Brown University, coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria to describe cases where adolescents, many of them autistic, suddenly began to identify as transgender after an increased exposure to pro-trans content online. And her research suggests that in some cases, this is not an innate identity, but a socially influenced phenomena. Now let's discuss medical interventions. Puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones are often presented as safe and reversible solutions for gender dysphoric youth. However, the science is far from settled. Studies show that puberty blockers have and can lead to a discrete decrease in bone density, some impaired brain development, and even infertility. A 2021 report from the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine stated that autistic individuals may be particularly vulnerable to regret after undergoing gender-affirming medical treatments. Why? Well, because they often struggle with long-term decision-making and understanding of future consequences.
Questions about how and whether children should be able to reassign their gender. Children like Keira Bell, who never imagined her story would lead her here.
I'm delighted at the judgment of the court today. It was a judgment that will protect vulnerable people. I wish it had been made for me before I embarked on the devastating experiment of puberty blockers. My life would be very different today.
Keira was 16 when she went to the Tavistock Centre. She started receiving hormone blockers and later surgery to become Quincy. She regretted the decision, and today, in a landmark ruling, a judge said her case had shown it's doubtful 14 and 15-year-olds could understand long-term risks of treatment, and highly unlikely children under 13 can give competent consent.
I was extremely upset and Just realizing how traumatic the experience was, and how deceitful I feel that the clinicians were during my care. It was heartbreaking.
Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from detransitioners, young people, many of them autistic, who regret their medical transitions. One example is Keira, a woman who took puberty blockers as a teenager and has later sued the UK's Tavistock Gender Clinic for failing to consider her underlying mental health struggles, including autism. She, like many others, have spoken out about how she was pushed into transitioning without a proper psychological evaluation. Now, despite these concerns, many medical institutions push an affirmation-only approach, which discourages questioning a child's gender identity. This is dangerous. Instead of exploring the underlying mental health conditions such as autism, anxiety, or depression, children are often fast-tracked into irreversible medical procedures. Sweden, Finland, and the UK have already begun restricting youth medical transitions due to these risks. But shouldn't we be taking the same cautious approach across the world? At the end of the day, this isn't about denying transgender identities. It's about ensuring that children, especially autistic children, aren't being misled into irreversible medical decisions without proper evaluation. We need to allow room for careful, individualized care rather than blanket affirmation. If you found this video informative, please like, share and subscribe. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going, but of course, let's keep it respectful and kind.